Hello everybody, thanks for joining. If you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube channel, check us out at avexa.com. In this video, I'm going to go over what Python variables are. So what are Python variables? Python variables you can think of as labels attached to specific names that you want to use in your programs or characters that you want to use in your programs. So what does that mean? I'll give you an example. X, I can point to the value of 10. What does that mean? That means that when I create a simple program where I call to print x, it prints out 10. That means x is actually pointing at 10, so in memory x is storing the value of 10. What happens if I redefine x as 20 and I print x? Well, in the first scenario, x is pointing at 10, so it prints out 10. In the second scenario, when I redefine x to equal 20, x is now pointing to 20. So again, you can think of it as labels. X is like at a grocery store, it's mayonnaise. 10 and 20 are simply prices that change. So x, the price tag is pointing to 10, and then now it's pointing to 20. This can be really powerful, but let's see what happens when we introduce a second variable. Let's call it y. Let's say y is equal to x. Now when I go to print y, let's see what happens. Okay, so the first scenario, we're printing x when it's pointing at 10. The second scenario, we're printing x while it's pointing at 20. Now we're pointing y to x. When we print y, it equals 20. And that's because x is currently pointing to 20. So when y points to x, it's actually pointing to 20 indirectly. Let's introduce a third variable and see what happens. We'll call it z. Let's do z is equal to y plus x. Let's print out z and see what we get. Okay, there's a few different things going on here. So the first is that z is now pointing at y plus x, which means z is actually simply 20 plus 20, or 40. The more powerful thing going on here is that Python is inherently recognizing that y and x are integers, or pointing at integers. So what does that mean? Well, if I changed x to be mat, which is a string, let's see what happens when we run that. So in the first scenario, x is pointing at 10, which is an integer. So that's 10. In the second scenario, x is pointing now at mat, a string. So when we print that, it prints out mat. Now y is pointing at x, which is pointing at mat now. So when I print y, it prints out mat. The fourth scenario is the most interesting one. In this scenario, it was summing the two integers. Now that y and x are strings called mat, when I print z, it's actually concatenating the strings. So Python itself is recognizing the data type in which these variables are storing values. This is extremely interesting, and you have to keep this in mind, because now think about if I specify y to equal 20. Let's see what happens. Python throws an error. It can't convert the string to integer, which is mat, because this is not an integer. So when you do mat plus 20, it doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know whether to concatenate or to sum. It doesn't know how to handle it. When this is an integer, though, and I'll just delete this so we can see what exactly, 10, 20, for the first two variables, and z now knows to sum these two integers. So Python, you can see, is extremely powerful and very smart, and the most important thing you can do with these variables is that you can reuse them in your functions, you can reuse them in your programs, and simply change the inputs. The structure of the programs and computations that you do can remain the exact same, but with changing inputs, and so outputs reflect those changes. This is extremely, extremely important, and if you didn't watch this video, or understand everything in the video, please watch it again before moving on. Thanks, everyone.